They laughed before they answered. Not loudly, not cruelly. It was the kind of laughter people use when they believe a question doesn't deserve seriousness. Brief, dismissive, almost embarrassed on his behalf. He noticed it immediately. The office smelled of paper and floor polish, the kind used in public buildings that wanted to appear orderly no matter what they contained. He stood at the counter, holding a folded document, waiting for the clerk to finish scanning the page. When she looked up, she smiled reflexively. "I'm looking for my parents," he said, calmly, clearly. The smile faltered. Someone behind her exhaled through their nose. Another clerk glanced over, then away. The laughter came then, soft, shared, unintentional, as if he had asked something naive, something unrealistic. "Those records don't really exist," the clerk said, still smiling. "Most people don't find anything useful." Useful. He nodded, absorbing the word without reacting. He had learned long ago that emotion invited deflection, precision forced response. He had not come expecting answers. He had come expecting resistance. This story is not about cruelty. It is about how dismissal becomes a second disappearance. He was born after the war, raised by relatives who spoke carefully and answered questions with gestures instead of sentences. He grew up surrounded by partial explanations, stories that ended early, names that were never repeated. By the time he was old enough to notice the gaps had already hardened into something permanent. They told him his parents had not returned. Returned from where was never specified. As a child, he imagined them delayed, lost, somewhere else. As an adult, he learned how language worked, how absence could be packaged as inevitability, how silence could be framed as kindness. That was why he stood in the office now, not searching for closure, searching for confirmation. The clerk finally turned the screen toward him. "See," she said, "nothing listed." The space where names should have been was blank, not crossed out, not marked unknown, empty. The emptiness was intentional. He recognized it instinctively. This was not a missing file. It was a resolved one. Someone had decided long ago that this question no longer needed an answer. He asked one more thing. "Are there transport records?" The room shifted. The clerk hesitated. Someone behind her cleared their throat. The laughter did not return. Instead, the tone changed, careful now, procedural. "Those are sensitive," she said. "Why are you asking now?" Now, as if memory expired, as if curiosity had a deadline. He folded his paper slowly and thanked her. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. He stood on the steps for a long moment, replaying the laughter in his mind, not because it hurt, but because it revealed something important. They did not laugh because his question was unreasonable. They laughed because they believed the answer was settled. That belief, that his parents' absence had already been agreed upon, was the real record, and he understood then that the truth would not come from asking politely. It would come from forcing the system to confront something it had decided no longer mattered. The laughter had been the warning. What followed would be resistance, because when records finally speak, they rarely say what people are prepared to hear, and he was about to learn why the town preferred laughter to answers. He changed tactics the same day. He stopped asking the town to confirm what it had learned to deny. Instead, he began looking for systems that could not laugh. Archives, registries, regional offices where names were numbers and questions were processed instead of judged. He took a train 2 hours away to a regional administration building, the kind with long corridors and quiet waiting rooms. The air smelled of damp coats and old radiator heat. People sat with folders on their laps, eyes fixed forward, as if movement might invite attention. When his turn came,
He did not say parents, he said file. "I'd like to request a review of my family status record," he told the official. "There appears to be a blank entry." Blank entry, administrative language, harder to dismiss. The official nodded without emotion and handed him a form. Name, date of birth, place of birth, guardians, known relatives. Each field felt like a test, not of truth, but of permission, whether he was allowed to ask at all. The micro-twist came when the official paused at the birthplace line. "You're from that town," she said, eyes moving from paper to his face, not accusing, observing. Her tone suggested she already understood the pattern. "You're from that town," she said, eyes moving from paper to his face, not accusing, observing. Her tone suggested she already understood the pattern. They often keep things simple. Simple was another word for erased. She stamped the form, then slid it back to him. "You'll need supporting documentation," she said. "If the local registry is incomplete, we can cross-check wartime transfers and post-war resettlement lists." Resettlement lists. The phrase landed with weight. It implied there were lists, that nothing exists had been a lie, or at least a convenience. He left the building with a new kind of unease, not from despair, but from proximity. He was closer now, close enough that the town's laughter looked less like ignorance and more like strategy. Over the next weeks, he collected what he could. A faded guardianship certificate, a school enrollment note with an address scratched out and replaced, a medical record stamped by a clinic that no longer existed, small objects of bureaucracy, each one a breadcrumb leading toward something larger. The looming shadow returned as a familiar warning, delivered casually. A distant cousin told him, "Be careful, people don't like this being reopened." The cousin said it with concern, but his eyes carried something else, fear of friction, fear of becoming visible in someone else's story. The moral dilemma began to take shape. If he continued, he would force the town to confront what it had buried. That confrontation would spread outward, touching people who had built lives on the convenience of blanks. If he stopped, he would remain the orphan forever, his questions treated as childish and therefore harmless. He could accept the identity they had assigned him, or he could risk becoming the person who disrupted the narrative everyone relied on. The first irreversible turn came in the mail. A letter from the regional office arrived in a plain envelope. Inside was a short notice. His request had triggered a cross-reference search. Several entries matched his family line. The results were pending verification, but the phrase that mattered was printed clearly. Relevant wartime transport documentation located. His hands trembled slightly as he read it again. Transport documentation. The system had found something the town had insisted did not exist. He understood then why they had laughed. Not because there was nothing to find, because they had trained themselves to treat the question as ridiculous, hoping ridicule would end the search. It had almost worked. Now it couldn't. As he folded the letter, he realized the next phase would not be about curiosity, it would be about consequences. Because once records begin to speak, they do not speak only to the person asking. They speak to everyone who benefited from the silence.
The town noticed before he said a word. It happened the way these things always do, not through confrontation, but through atmosphere. Conversations shortened, greetings lost their warmth, doors closed more decisively than before. No one mentioned records, no one mentioned his parents, but the laughter was gone, replaced by something tighter and less forgiving. He understood what that meant. The micro-twist arrived when he realized the town hadn't been ignorant, it had been informed. Someone at the regional office had contacted the local registry for confirmation.
Procedures required it. Cross-checks always did. The town hadn't laughed because the question was absurd. It had laughed because the answer threatened to reopen agreements made long ago and never revisited. The early fracture came at the municipal archive. He requested copies of any correspondence sent to the regional office. The archivist hesitated, then retrieved a thin folder, too thin to be honest. Inside were routine forms and a single memo stamped decades earlier. The language was neutral, technical, devastating. Family status unresolved, no follow-up required. No follow-up required. Someone had decided that uncertainty itself was sufficient closure. He stood there longer than necessary, absorbing the sentence. It explained everything: the laughter, the blank entries, the confidence with which they dismissed him. His parents had not been erased violently. They had been categorized as incomplete and then ignored. The looming shadow sharpened when people began offering advice again. "You have to be realistic," a neighbor said. "Records were messy back then." "Digging into this won't bring anyone back," another added. "You'll only hurt yourself," someone else warned. The advice shared a single assumption: that his search was emotional, not factual, that he was chasing feelings, not documents. It was a strategy designed to move the conversation out of the realm of evidence and into personal fragility. He refused the reframing. He returned to the regional office and submitted additional materials: addresses, surnames, dates that matched transport routes. He did not argue, he aligned. Bureaucracy, he had learned, responded best to structure. Days later, another letter arrived. Verification complete. His parents' names appeared in the registry, not locally but regionally, attached to a transport record dated late summer, early in the wave that no one in town liked to specify. The document did not describe what happened after. It did not need to. The records had spoken. The moral dilemma arrived with unexpected clarity. If he accepted the confirmation quietly, the town could continue pretending nothing had changed. He would have answers. The system would remain intact. If he acknowledged it publicly, the laughter would be exposed as defense, not misunderstanding. He understood now that truth alone did not disrupt systems. Visibility did. The secret act came not in confrontation, but in copying. He made certified copies of the records and mailed them to two places: a historical institute and a legal aid organization specializing in wartime documentation. He did not accuse the town. He simply ensured the information existed beyond its reach. The response was immediate and chilling. A municipal official requested a meeting to clarify misunderstandings. The wording echoed the old memo perfectly: neutral, technical, final. He declined. That was the moment the town stopped laughing entirely. Silence returned, but not the comfortable kind. This silence was alert, defensive, the kind that waits for escalation. He realized then that asking about his parents was never the true transgression. The real offense was refusing to accept that their disappearance had already been agreed upon. The town believed the matter was closed. The records had reopened it. And once reopened, the question was no longer what happened to his parents. It was who decided the answer didn't matter. The meeting invitation did not disappear after he declined it. Instead, it changed tone. A second letter arrived, shorter, firmer, framed as procedural necessity. It cited cooperation, accuracy, and the importance of avoiding misinterpretation of historical materials. The language was careful, but the intent was clear. The town wanted back inside the process. The micro twist came when he recognized the strategy. They were no longer trying to stop the records. They were trying to manage what the records would mean. He agreed to meet, but not privately. He requested that any discussion include a representative from the regional office. The reply took longer this time. When it came, it accepted his condition without comment. Silence, he noticed, was becoming their default response whenever leverage failed. The meeting took place in a municipal room that smelled faintly of dust and chalk. A long table, too many chairs. The town officials arrived with folders already open, as if the conversation were underway without him. They spoke first. They acknowledged his right to search. They expressed sympathy. They emphasized complexity. They warned against drawing conclusions from partial documentation. Each sentence worked to shrink the scope of what the records implied. Then the regional representative spoke. She did not argue. She listed dates, file numbers, corresponding transport codes. She described the verification process and confirmed that the records met archival standards. Her voice was even, professional, immune to local discomfort. The room changed. For the first time, the town officials were not in control of the narrative. Their authority depended on familiarity. The regional office operated on protocol. Familiarity meant nothing there. The moral dilemma surfaced again, this time not his, but theirs. To challenge the records openly would invite scrutiny. To accept them quietly would require adjusting the town's story. Either path carried risk. The silence that followed was not indecision, it was calculation. The secret act came afterward. As people gathered their papers, one official lingered. He leaned in and spoke quietly. "You should be careful how far you take this," he said. "Some things were settled long ago." Settled by whom was left unsaid. He did not respond. Instead, he noticed the official's hand resting protectively on a folder marked with a familiar code, the same code that appeared on his parents' transport record. The town had copies too. It always had. That was the revelation. The laughter, the dismissal, the insistence that nothing existed. They had known. They had always known. The silence was not built on uncertainty, but on agreement. That night, he added a new page to his growing file. Not about his parents, but about the town. About how institutions behave when facts threaten stability. About how memory is negotiated, not discovered. The records had spoken. Now the town would have to decide whether it would continue pretending it had never heard them. And he understood that from this point on, the question was no longer about finding the truth. It was about what people do when the truth refuses to stay quiet. After the meeting, the town began rehearsing a new posture. It was no longer dismissive, it was conciliatory on the surface. Officials spoke about cooperation, about shared goals, about the importance of context. Context became the word they reached for whenever facts felt too sharp. It softened edges, it blurred responsibility, it implied that understanding should come before acknowledgement. The micro-twist came when he noticed what was missing. No one denied the records anymore. They simply stopped mentioning them. The town's language shifted subtly. Where there had once been laughter, there was now omission. His parents' names were not challenged, but they were not integrated either. The truth was being treated like an inconvenience that could be outlasted through patience. He understood the tactic immediately. Silence had failed, so now they would try dilution. The moral dilemma deepened. If he pressed publicly, he would be accused of hostility, of refusing reconciliation. If he remained quiet, the town would absorb the records without consequence, folding them into administrative normalcy until their impact disappeared. Truth would exist, technically, but change would not. That was when he made a choice that felt almost insignificant. He requested copies of school curricula. He wanted to know how the town taught its own past. The request surprised people. It seemed unrelated, harmless. The documents were handed over without resistance. And there, between pages of dates and summaries, he saw it clearly. The war years compressed into a few neutral paragraphs. Deportations described as relocations. Absence framed as disruption. No names, no local specificity. The silence had been institutionalized early. The secret act came quietly, without announcement. He sent the verified records, his parents' names included, to a national educational archive that supported curriculum review. He did not demand changes. He submitted documentation, evidence, sources that could not be dismissed as personal grievance. Weeks passed. Then a notice arrived informing the town that its historical materials were under review for accuracy and completeness. The phrasing was neutral, the implication was not. The looming shadow returned, heavier now. A former teacher approached him one evening, voice tight. "You're causing trouble," she said, not unkindly. "People are anxious." Anxious about what? He wondered. The answer came soon enough. A local council meeting was announced to address concerns about historical representation. The town was being forced, slowly, bureaucratically, to confront the gap between what it knew and what it taught. At the meeting, emotions surfaced for the first time. Not grief, not guilt, fear. Fear that names would require explanations. Fear that explanations would require responsibility. Fear that the past, once made specific, would no longer stay safely abstract. He did not speak at the meeting. He did not need to. The records were present. The review process was underway. The town could argue tone, but not existence. It could debate interpretation, but not documentation. For the first time, remembering was no longer his burden alone. It had become an administrative problem. And administrative problems, unlike moral ones, do not disappear when people look away. As he left the meeting, he realized something quietly decisive. His parents' absence had shaped his life in silence. Now their names were shaping the town's future in discomfort. The laughter that had greeted his first question felt distant now, almost naive, because the town had learned the hardest lesson records can teach. Once truth is written into systems, forgetting is no longer a personal choice. It becomes a public act of resistance. And resistance, unlike laughter, always leaves a trace. The review did not unfold the way he had imagined. There were no dramatic inspections, no public announcements, no officials marching through the town with clipboards. Instead, the process seeped in quietly, like dampness, slow, invisible, impossible to ignore once it settled. Requests for clarification were sent, counterstatements submitted, dates questioned, language debated. Each exchange stripped a little more certainty from the story the town had relied on for decades. The micro-twist came from an unexpected place. A junior archivist from the national office wrote to him privately, not officially, not on letterhead. The message was brief and careful. She explained that many wartime files had been marked administratively closed in the late 1940s, not because they were resolved, but because reopening them would have required acknowledging how widespread the disappearances had been. "If one case is fully corrected," she wrote, "others will follow." He read the sentence several times. The problem was no longer his parents. His parents were the entry point. The moral dilemma sharpened with sudden clarity. If he continued, he would not just force the town to confront its past. He would destabilize a larger settlement, one built on the quiet agreement that revisiting certain years was too costly to justify. Silence had protected not only individuals, but systems, and systems resist exposure differently. Pressure returned, this time indirect. A lawyer he had never contacted suggested a conversation. A community mediator proposed a compromise statement. Someone hinted that public acknowledgement could be paired with language emphasizing uncertainty, balance, shared suffering. Memory, they implied, could be negotiated. He understood what they were offering: recognition without consequence. The secret act came in what he refused to sign. A draft statement was placed in front of him, carefully worded, empathetic, vague. It acknowledged loss during the war period without naming mechanisms or responsibility. His parents' names were included, but only as part of a broader anonymized tragedy. It would have given him public validation. It would have given the town closure. He declined. Not angrily, not dramatically. He simply said the document did not match the records. After that, the tone hardened. Meetings became colder, emails shorter. People began speaking to him as if he were naive, as if he did not understand the complexity of what he was disrupting. Complexity, he realized, was the final defense of silence, an argument so large it discouraged action. He returned to the records instead. He mapped timelines, compared language across decades, noted how terms shifted from temporary to unconfirmed to settled. The pattern was unmistakable. Absence had been normalized step by step until it felt inevitable. One evening, while reviewing documents, he noticed something small. A marginal note on an old registry form, initials barely legible. The same initials appeared on multiple files from the same period, always next to cases marked "no further action." A signature. Someone had been responsible for deciding when questions ended. The town had not simply forgotten, it had delegated forgetting. That realization changed everything, because responsibility, once traceable, could no longer hide behind abstraction. Names were no longer just missing. Decisions had been made, repeated, institutionalized. He understood then why the laughter had come so easily at the beginning. They were not laughing at ignorance, they were laughing at confidence, the confidence that the system would hold. Now it wasn't, and he knew the next phase would not be administrative at all. When silence collapses, people stop debating history. They start protecting themselves. And the town was about to show him exactly how far it was willing to go to keep the past from becoming personal.
Protection arrived disguised as concern. People stopped discussing records and began discussing him, his motivations, his stability, when their grief had distorted his judgment. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The problem was no longer the past, but the person refusing to let it stay buried. The micro-twist came when he realized this strategy was familiar. It mirrored the language used decades earlier, redirecting attention away from decisions and toward temperament. If you could question the seeker, you didn't have to confront what was found. A neighbor suggested rest. A distant relative asked if he was quoting well. Someone recommended speaking to a counselor, not unkindly, but with an implication that searching itself was a symptom. Concern became a tool, compassion a boundary. The moral dilemma sharpened again. If he defended himself publicly, he would reinforce the idea that his search was emotional. If he stayed silent, the narrative would solidify around him anyway. Either way, attention would move away from records and back onto him. He chose to redirect without arguing. He submitted a formal request to the National Archive asking for a public index of administratively closed cases from the same period as his parents' files. No commentary, no conclusions, just a list. Names, dates, initials where applicable. The request could not be framed as personal grievance. It was methodological. When the index was published, it did something the town could not undo. Patterns emerged. Dozens of families marked unresolved, the same initials appearing again and again, the same language, the same years. What had once seemed like an isolated absence now appeared as a system. The town reacted with a new kind of silence, not defensive, exposed. People stopped making suggestions. Conversations became careful. The effort required to maintain denial had increased, and effort changes behavior. Teachers adjusted phrasing. Officials paused before answering. The certainty that it once protected them had been replaced by awareness. The long echo had begun. He noticed it one afternoon in the square, where two men were arguing quietly near a notice board displaying the archive reference. One pointed at a name, the other shook his head, not in disagreement, but in resignation. "That one too?" he heard one of them say. It was not outrage, it was recognition. He understood then that the town was not preparing to confess, it was recalibrating. When systems are confronted with undeniable patterns, they rarely admit wrongdoing outright. Instead, they alter future behavior. They become cautious. They avoid repetition. They change quietly, without apology. This was the most realistic outcome he had ever expected. That evening, he packed his files into a single box, not because the work was finished, but because it no longer depended on him alone. The records existed. The index existed. The questions had escaped private rooms and entered public space. He realized something with unexpected calm. He had not forced the town to remember. He had forced it to be unable to forget without effort. And that was enough. The laughter that had greeted his first question felt impossibly distant now, not because it had been replaced by remorse, but because it could no longer survive contact with what had been written down. The next step would not belong to him. It would belong to those who had to decide how to live beside a truth that refused to disappear again. And that decision, he knew, would outlast any answer he had been searching for.
He never found a final sentence that explained what happened to his parents. No document offered closure. No record supplied a neat ending. The system did not reward his persistence with certainty. It rewarded it with something stranger, and in some ways more important, visibility. His parents' names were no longer blanks. They were entries, referenced, indexed, linked to processes that could be tracked, compared, questioned. The disappearance that had once been treated as private grief had become part of a public pattern the town could no longer pretend was accidental. The micro-twist came in the form of a small correction. Months after the index was published, the National Archive issued an update. Certain cases previously marked "no further action" were to be reclassified pending review based on newly identified procedural inconsistencies. The language was cautious. It did not accuse anyone, but it quietly invalidated the confidence that had supported the town's laughter. No further action was no longer acceptable. He read the update twice, then folded it and placed it in his box of papers, not as a victory, but as proof that systems could be forced to revise themselves, slowly, reluctantly, when confronted with their own patterns. He left the town soon after, not out of bitterness, not out of triumph. He understood that staying would only invite the next phase, social negotiation, pressure to soften, pressure to be reasonable. He had no interest in bargaining with memory. He wanted the record to stand without his presence becoming the story. Before he boarded the train, he walked past the municipal office one last time. The same steps, the same polished floors inside, the same smell of paper and disinfectant. He pictured the laughter again, not as cruelty, but as confidence. The confidence that questions expired, that orphans eventually stopped asking, that absence could be treated as settled if enough time passed. He had proven that confidence wrong. Years later, a teacher from the town wrote to him. She did not apologize, she did not explain. She simply said that her students had started asking questions after seeing the index. They were asking about names, about language, about why certain years were described so vaguely. The teacher wrote, "It's different now. They notice what isn't said." That was the long echo. His parents' story would never be fully recovered, but their disappearance had become harder to domesticate, harder to tidy into polite silence. Their names now resisted convenience. He kept the box of documents in his home until the end, not displayed, not romanticized, simply preserved. When someone once asked him why he kept searching, even after he'd learned how incomplete the answers would be, he replied with a quiet honesty that startled them. "Because they wanted me to stop asking," he said, "and stopping is how disappearances become permanent." They laughed when he asked about his parents. Then the records spoke. Not with a perfect ending, but with a refusal to let the question vanish again. And in the world he lived in afterward, that refusal was a kind of justice that lasted.